Hi.
talk was very nice.
Thank you.
I have in one of your graphs, you have shown that acceptance to the evolution theory was increased from 16 to 19% in year 2014. At the end of year 2013, Nobel Prize was awarded to the discovery of Higgs boson particle. Was that one of the factors to increase that belief from 16 to 19%?
You're talking about the increase in the number of people that accept
Acceptance for
evolution?
evolution theory.
Well, my explanation, I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, but I think I know what the answer is, and I think the answer is that America is becoming less religious. And so if, there's no reason to be a creationist if you're not religious. Because why would you oppose such strong facts unless you had any kind of religious reason? There's no political reason to oppose evolution. So what's happening in America, if you follow the statistics, is that we're becoming, like most of Western Europe, a less religious country. Right now, the fastest growing group of so-called believers in America are what we call the nones, people that are not affiliated with any church whatsoever. They're either spiritual or they're atheists. And so once you give up the idea of being religious, then you no longer have this impediment to accepting evolution. So I think that accounts for the increase. And I think that really is a real increase that's going to continue to go up. In Western Europe, they're 200 years ahead of us. I mean, most of them have given up God. They'll go to church in the way I've heard that many Hindus do, as a cultural thing rather than as a, they don't really believe the dogma. And in Western Europe, so Denmark and Sweden, for example, and Iceland are completely atheistic countries. In Iceland, 0% of the youth under 25 believe in God. And their acceptance of evolution is 100%. So there's this very strong correlation, and I think that's the explanation for the phenomenon.
So there is a paradoxical argument which says that being religious is evolutionary beneficial. It was evolutionary beneficial and continues to be so in many ways. And therefore it is understandable that many people don't believe in evolution. It wouldn't be very wise to call them irrational or idiotic.
Well, I didn't call them irrational or idiotic. I would call them ignorant. But not ignorant in the sense that, well, a lot of people that don't like evolution are ignorant in the sense that they don't know the facts. Whether or not a religiosity is an evolutionary process or not, whether the idea that believing in God is in our genes is a very contentious statement. I mean, you said that scientists know this, but they don't know that. I mean, there are many, many theories that religion, that we're an animal of curiosity, and when we couldn't understand things early in our evolution, we had to find some reason. And since we didn't know science, we thought, well, maybe there was a God. There's a man named Pascal Boyer who thinks that it's adaptive, that religion is a byproduct of other evolutionary adaptations. For example, the agency detection, that if something happens, like we get sick, or lightning comes from the sky and kills somebody, we want to know why, and we have to have a reason for it, and that's agency detection. And since we didn't have the reasons back then the byproduct of this agency detection facility would be, well, maybe there's a God up in the sky. Once that took hold in the human species, like any other ideology, it's a hard one to dispel, not only because it explained things, but because it comforts us. And I think that's the main, I gave you all these reasons why people reject evolution. Every one of them comes down to the fact that religion makes me feel good about myself, and evolution makes me feel bad about myself. Well, the truth is that evolution is true. And if it makes you feel bad about yourself, my answer would be get over it. Because look, we can get over these things. We all know we're going to die. That's a horrible fact. I don't like it. I stay awake at night sometimes thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to be here in 20 years. But we have to come to terms with that. And we have to come to terms with evolution too. And religion no longer makes any sense in the world, not only because it doesn't explain anything, but because there's no evidence. If I give a lecture like, why God is true, it would be like 1 second long, because there's no evidence for it that I can see. So, religion doesn't make sense in a world in which we have science and we can explain things, and in which, when we attack the hard problems, the answer always turns out to be materialistic science rather than something supernatural. Religious people aren't stupid. Because there's a lot of famous scientists who are religious. Ronald Fisher was one of them. My own academic grandfather was one. I tend to think of them more as having cognitive dissonance, that they have two things that are tearing their brains apart. One of them is scientific truth. The other one is, this makes me feel good, and they're not able to resolve this dissonance. So then they become theistic evolutionists. That's what happens. So.
Hi. In continuation to his question, so why do you think that the religion was able to dominate science to accept or to reject the theory of evolution? Is it just because the proponents of religion that time were able to deliver the message much better than scientific community then?
Not only deliver the message, yeah, but punish those who didn't go along with the message. Like the Inquisition. You remember what happened to Galileo? When he had his telescope, they showed him the instruments of torture and said, you better give up this idea. So for a long period of time, the church had absolute power over society, and that actually prevented people from doing science. But then in like the 16th century, science got going. The Enlightenment came, at least in the Western world. I mean, science was going in India a long time ago, but science as a modern concern largely developed in the West, and it was because the Enlightenment came. Why that happened at that particular time and place, Steve Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is an explanation for that. But the reason I think, that for hundreds of years the church suppressed learning. In the Dark Ages, they would burn books, they had prohibited books, which included Darwin, which included Galileo, which included Newton. And so if you have such a powerful force in society repressing curiosity, then naturally science is not going to progress. But eventually it did, because people started finding out it worked. It helped us cure diseases, it helped us improve our lives, and religion doesn't really do that in the same way. So, that would be my answer, but I'm not a sociologist.
And when do you think this concept of God was originated in the history? Because it seems like it's originated completely independently in different continents on the earth.
Well, we're not sure about that. I mean, God could have originated in Africa before the humans left Africa about 60,000 years ago, and then took different forms in different places. So although we know that societies around the world, like the ancient Aztecs and the Mayans and Chinese but remember they had God took different forms. And even in Buddhism there isn't really any God. But I don't think that means that there's an independent origin of God in these places. I think people that are scholars of religion trace back the origins of a religious belief at least 20,000 years. And it could be longer, than that. So, the fact is that all we know is that different societies have different religions. If you're implying that means there's something inherent about humanity that would make us believe in God, well, I'd be willing to accept that too, because it's comforting. It's comforting to think that there's somebody looking after us. It's comforting to think that when we die, we're not really going to die. We're going to live on in some other form. Not everybody believes that. I guess in Hinduism, you come back as something else. In Judaism, which was my religion, you don't go, you die, and that's it. But, that would be my answer to that.
So, as an educator, what age do you think should evolution be introduced in the school curriculum? First question, and how it should be unfolded over the years in school curricula?
The first question was when it should be introduced?
Yeah.
That's really a question for teachers. I'm not really a pedagogy expert, but in America, it's introduced far too late. It's introduced in the 11th or 12th grades, which means you're about 16 or 17 years old in high school biology. That's way too late. There are children's books written for 6 to 7 years old, and Richard Dawkins has written a new one called The Magic of Reality, which is meant for children of about 10 to 13. I think at about 10 years old or so, you start telling kids that we came from. I don't think you can really start too early. I mean, if you're going to tell them about God when they're 1 year old, then you can tell them about Darwin when they're 1 year old. If you're going to lie to them when they're 1, you might as well tell them the truth when they're 1. And what was the second?
So, evolution is a complex thing to understand. It takes some time to get the grasp of the entire concept.
Yes.
So, how it should be unfolded, because I believe it should be done in phases or
Yes.
year by year.
Absolutely.
So, what should be a plan for that in your
Again,
opinion?
I would leave that for the teachers. I mean, but You know, I just taught you evolution in an hour. I think anybody that came in here not knowing about evolution would leave knowing a little bit more about it, and they wouldn't understand some things like about how natural selection worked, because that's actually, there's a lot of misunderstandings about that. But the simple fact that there's evolution and there's branching and things have common ancestors, you could teach that quite early. The mechanism of how that works should probably be left for later because it's a bit more complicated. But certainly, I mean, the first children's book that I've seen recently in America is called Grandmother Fish, which is for kids about 5 or 6, and it teaches them that their distant ancestor, their grandmother, was a fish, which is true. So that's the first thing you should tell them, that life evolved, and then maybe it branched, and then later on, you get into natural selection and the mechanism of evolutionary change. It's not rocket science. It's not quantum mechanics, you know. So what's hard is natural selection. And even that's not that hard. You can do computer programs that will show it working very easily, but there's a lot of misconceptions about that children need to be older to be able to understand.
So you spoke about Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould in the same light, as in both of them have definitely made significant contribution towards popularizing evolution and in general in the field of evolution. There's a lot of controversy, as in both of them were like opponents. So if you had to side with, as in when you teach evolution, do you take the examples of both the theories that they have proposed, even John Maynard Smith, or would you agree with more compared to the other one or something?
So were the two names, was Dawkins and Gould, were those the two?
Yeah, and even John Maynard Smith, the debates between them.
Yeah, Maynard Smith was, you could lump him together with Richard Dawkins pretty much. I mean, you know, they were both great teachers of evolution, but Steve Gould had a problem, and that problem was called punctuated equilibrium, because he wedded his life to this new theory of his, and it turns out that punctuated equilibrium, I won't go into the mechanisms of it, as a theory of evolutionary change, as a theory of mechanism, has not been well supported. So, you know, Gould spent a lot of his popular writing publicizing this theory, and it's turned out that not many people accept it anymore. So, you know, both of them were very good popularizers and teachers of evolution. If I had to say that one of them taught evolution better than the other, more correctly, it would have to be Richard Dawkins by far. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't read Steve Gould. There's a lot of good stuff in there to read, you know. He didn't always write about punctuated equilibrium, so.
I always have a question that, being a biology student, that we cannot create an artificial cell in lab. We cannot put life into it. We can culture it, we can propagate it, we can insert, delete genes. So how do you define that liveliness, that energy in your terms? So do you think because of that people believe in God or people believe in religion, or how to differentiate it?
So I'm not sure what the question is. So you say there's a lot of people that believe in God because we cannot create early forms of life in the laboratory. And what was the question exactly? What's my response to that? Sorry?
That more or less, that's the meaning of.
Oh, yeah. Well, my answer is I don't know. I mean, when somebody asks me how life began, and this is a tactic that creationists use over and over again in America. They find gaps in our knowledge, and they say that because we don't understand this, that there must be God. Well, the origin of life is a very hard problem because we weren't there, and it was very complex to figure out how you could get both proteins and DNA working in a way that they both require each other, and then where the first cell came from. I firmly believe that someday, probably in your lifetime, not in mine, we will create life in the laboratory. But that does not mean that that's the way it happened on the planet. I don't think we'll ever really know how life actually started on Earth, but we can at least approximate it. RNA is a good vessel for that. But to take this tactic, which is called God of the Gap, saying because we don't understand something, that therefore God, I mean, think of all the ways that was used. 200 years ago, epilepsy was thought to be explained by God. People would have fits, they'd fall on the ground, and they'd say, well, that's demonic possession. Well, now we know it's electrical impulses in the brain. People that had Black Death, bubonic plague, they were thought to be punished by God, you know, and because we didn't understand. And now we know it's due to a bacterium. Lightning used to be thought of as punishment by God. So there are so many things, I have a whole list in my book of that we used to be ignorant of, And every single one of those has been understood as a scientific explanation. So it's a really bad tactic. And even many theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer will say, if you're going to use God to fill the gaps in your knowledge, then each time those gaps are filled with science, your God gets smaller and smaller and smaller until he disappears completely. So if you want to believe in God, that's not the way that you should do it, I think. So.
Among the things that you said about, one of the reasons why you said, one of the things you said would convince somebody that evolution is false is that a lack of some sort of step-by-step mechanism towards some sort of property or some sort of behavior or something of that sort.
Well, if we could not explain an adaptation as having arisen through a
Right.
series of adaptive steps, yeah.
So, as in, for example, eyesight seems pretty amazing, or being able to fly. Could one say something about when something is too amazing to actually have been evolved into, say, telepathy or bending spoons? Or
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
So could one say something about what is sort of too amazing a trait to acquire purely by means of evolution? For example, telepathy or...
Yeah, I mean,
whatever.
people have thought of them. Like the bacterial flagellum was one that for a long time creationists said, well, you can't evolve this in a step-by-step process. Yeah, sorry? The bacterial flagellum, that series of cilia or hairs that drive bacteria forward, people thought, well, you can't, there's no way I can envision that this could evolve adaptively, because where did it come from? And then people just studied the problem and they realized that there are biochemical precursors of the bacterial flagellum that are used as sort of part of the so-called immune system of bacteria, not really an immune system, but as transport proteins. So that now we have potential precursors of a system that you can envision. It's the same thing with the eye. I mean, the creationists for many years said, you can't evolve an eye because all the parts have to be there together. You need the lens, the cornea, the retina, the optic nerve, and how could they evolve together? And Darwin answered that question because he found that in living organisms, you can see every step of the process in one species or another. So we can find flatworms that have just a pigmented eye spot. And then we can find other worms in which there's a little bit of an invagination. Still mollusks in which there's a little lens over it. And so if you string all these species together, you can see a step-by-step way that he could have evolved. So every single case in which creationists say this could not have evolved in an adaptive manner have been taken apart by evolutionists.
Sir, what do you think is the future of evolution in human beings?
Of evolution what?
Yeah,
In human
future of evolution in human beings.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good question, and it's a question I'm always asked in a popular lecture. Where are we going? You know? And my answer is, if you look at the data, at how we're changing, and you can only look at that in the last, say, 30 years, how natural selection is acting. Our blood pressure is getting lower. Women are achieving menopause later, and they're arriving at reproductive maturity. In other words, they're menstruating the first time younger. So that's the trends that we know exist. So I can say 30 years from now, girls will be coming into reproductive maturity younger, and women will be achieving menopause later, and we'll all have lower blood pressure because people with high blood pressure tend to die early, even at reproductive age. But that's not what people want to hear. It's not very exciting, right? You want to know whether we're going to be smarter, whether we're going to be handsomer, taller, and the answer to that is I don't know. And the only way to answer that question is to see if there's a reproductive advantage. For example, if you think people are getting smarter, you'd have to show that the smarter people were leaving more offspring than the dumber people. And if that were the case, then we could say, well, yes, natural selection would make us more intelligent, but we don't have that data. First of all, it's not true as far as we can see now. It probably certainly was in the past, because that's probably what our brains are big. But now we have computers, we have, I mean, there's lots of ways we can bypass this reproductive advantage of being smart. And it would take years to do this kind of data. You need 3 or 4 human generations with complete data on IQs and reproductive output. And then you have to show that it's heritable, and we don't have that kind of data. So the way I answer that question is, I can tell you we're evolving, but it's not very interesting. The other ways we're evolving, we just have to wait and see. So.
Hello, sir.
I didn't look at any.
So, sir, my question is rather very basic.
Yes.
My question is, why did sex originate? Also, Why did see it was so robustly maintained in eukaryotes?
Why was what maintained?
It was so robustly maintained in eukaryotes. The
Oh,
sex.
yeah, you're asking me a question that's a very contentious issue in evolutionary biology. Why did sex originate in the first place? Why do organisms give up half their reproductive potential, give up half their genes, and unite them with genes from another individual to make a zygote? And there's lots of theories about that. And one of them is to get rid of deleterious genes through recombination. A very viable theory is maybe it's a way to stay ahead of parasites, that you can evolve faster if you're being attacked by parasites or diseases, if you can combine your genes with other organisms and then create favorable combinations of genes that are more resistant. But I cannot answer that question because evolutionary biology hasn't answered that question yet. Why it's maintained robustly? Well, it's hard to get rid of sex once you have it, because you have to evolve meiosis and mating and stuff like that. And once you evolve that system, it's hard to get rid of. That's why I think it's so robust. But it also has certain evolutionary advantages that we don't understand. So I'm going to have to really punt on your question and say that there's books and books and books on this, and we don't know the answer yet. So.
Okay, I think we have to stop here.
Okay.
So thank you very much, and a wonderful, the talk and all the interactions and the question answers. I think just to add a point, I don't know from where you got the statistics about India. It's everything that's said about India is both true and false.
Oh, really?
So, because the really about the evolution concept. There may be some mythological stories which talked about gradualism, right? It doesn't mean that they have understood evolution and they're considering it as true. Because if you look at the number of people who believe in religious mythology or miracles or reincarnation of life, I think it's almost more than 90%.
Yeah.
And so, again, the problem is not about the school education. Someone pointing out the school education. In the 4th standard in India nowadays, they teach some aspect of evolution, or in 5th standard. I think it's by the time they come to the school, they're already brainwashed.
And in terms of evolution?
About the religion.
Oh, yeah, well, that's true of everybody.
Yeah, so it's true, because the religion is at home, right, most of the time.
Yeah.
And by the time you come to the school, it's very difficult to erase it.
Yeah, when I saw the statistics...
And the teachers are not making conscious effort to erase it because teachers themselves are religious.
So your explanation for the high acceptance of evolution by Indians is that they just say that they accept it, but they don't really understand it?
There's some kind of a paradox again, right? Mm-hmm. They think they have understood it simply because in their mythology there are some elements of those kind of structures, right? A fish or a amphibian or something of that kind.
You think that they're actually,
but not necessarily that they have understood the natural selection and the gradual process.
Yeah,
and it's more like intelligent design for them.
Yeah.
It's not a real evolution by natural selection.
I see. Okay. I thought of that when I saw it was so high and that this country was so religious. Well, how can that be? And I thought, maybe...
They may not be creationists, they will be intelligent design.
Maybe I thought, Indians are interpreting evolution differently from the way Americans do, but that would imply that, they don't understand evolution as well as Americans do. And they accept it more because they're transferring their Hindu mythology into science. But that would imply, I didn't want to say that because to me it sort of implies that, it implies that there's a difference between the two cultures and how they understand evolution. And I don't know if that's true or not.
What I think is the main difference is that there is no organized resistance to the idea of evolution. What you say is true, that have they understood it? I don't think so, to a large extent. But fortunately, there are no such institutions which really fight evolution out of schools and colleges. That's more important.
Yeah. But the standards that they showed, the school standards, I presume they teach evolution properly in the schools here. And I presume that there's a law that kids have to go to school. And that curriculum that I showed for the Indian schools where they give evidence for evolution, that would imply that the kids actually do learn it at some point. Is that, no? But you don't think they retain what they've learned, or?
Well, I mean, again, for many people, biology. Again, the question why, as you said, people accept atoms, people accept that Earth is moving around the sun. Now, although 500 years ago it was not the case. Now, almost everybody accepts it, right, all over the world. Still, I think evolution is mostly because it's about the self. It's nothing about, So now evolution or anything in schools, whatever you study, is left to the school itself. It is something in the part of the textbook, is not part of the life.
Yes.
So in a way, Dobzhansky's statement is also about, he uses the word biology rather than life. If he had used the life, maybe it would have been more useful or meaningful. Right? Nothing in life makes sense except in the context of evolution, instead of nothing in biology. Biology means it's something is written in the textbook or meant for schools and examinations.
I see. Okay, so when I show this slide in Bangalore, I'll say Dr. Shashi tells me that these figures are inflated for this country of India. So I just took them at face value. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, tomorrow we'll come back here for the next talk. Thank you very much.